Today I'll be talking to you about everything you need to know about worms, how to establish a worm farm, how to improve your worm farming skills, and how to use the product at the end, and hopefully inspire you to spend more time with your worms and more time in your garden. G'day, my name is Cid Riley and I've been a commercial worm farmer since establishing Global Worming in 2006. Global Worming is all about organic waste management, and we manage around 6 tonnes of food waste per week. A lot of it's at facilities like this in Canberra and also Tarago, New South Wales, and each one of these worm farms can handle up to half a tonne of food waste per week, and we feed them every week. Doing it by hand, we're not using any machines at all. I think worms, first up, are the ultimate pet. They're an amazing animal, and you don't need to feed them every day. You don't have to clean up after them. Their poo actually smells nice, and if you go away on holidays, you don't have to get a worm sitter to look after them. So, great pet for a start. But it's the environmental benefits of worm farming which is so important. Worms keep food waste out of landfill and out of the waste stream. And by doing that, it's not getting buried and producing methane, which is a greenhouse gas that's 25 times worse for the environment than carbon dioxide. We're stopping that happening. So it's just a win-win. We're actually producing a very valuable product out of something that otherwise would get buried and poison the planet. Well, today, what we're doing on a large scale here is getting the basics right, and we want to help you get the basics right at home. Encourage you to become a worm farmer if you're not currently a worm farmer, and help you become a better worm farmer if you currently are. When you're starting off, it's trying to think about the fundamentals of worm farming. And there are 4 fundamentals that you need to think about. So the first fundamental is temperature. Worms hate hot conditions and they don't like things getting too cold. They're much like us, where the ideal condition is between about 18 and 24 degrees. Secondly is moisture. Worms need moisture to move around and survive. If the farm gets too saturated, it could start smelling and the worms aren't going to be happy. And if it gets too dry, they're not going to be able to move around and consume your food waste. Thirdly, worms hate light. The whole body of a worm is almost like an eye. It's a bit like if we're looking at the bright sun, it really hurts our eyes. For worms, their whole body is like an eye and it kill them really quick. And the fourth thing is something that brings all those things together. Really important for when you're establishing a worm farm for the first time or renovating your worm farm, and that's bedding. Bedding is the home base of the worms. It's almost like the lounge room where they're going to hang out, and the food scraps on top of the farm is the kitchen where they're going to consume things. So bedding material is really important to get right in the farm because it's somewhere where the worms can always go to if the conditions aren't quite right, i.e. too hot or too cold, and it's somewhere where they're going to consume that as well. So we'll go into a few more details in a minute about the best bedding to set up, and always think about those 4 fundamentals when it comes to worms. You should have no problems being a good long-term worm farmer. Okay, when it comes to worm farming and starting off for the first time, the most obvious question is, what's the best worm farm for me? A lot of it comes down to what situation you're living in, what space you might have available, and also how much food waste you're producing. Something that's really important to think about is the depth of the worm farm is what's going to keep them happy. It's going to make sure conditions don't get too hot or too cold, and the worms have always got somewhere to escape to. But the surface area of the worm farm is what manages food waste. And the more food waste you're producing, the greater surface area you need. Okay, so if we come here a bit, this is a very simple system. I don't even have a farm here at all. All I've got is a dedicated area for the worms here. Things planted here, tomato and some oregano, just planted potatoes here. But all I've got here is a piece of shade cloth, which is keeping the flies and things out of it. And if we peel that back and take that away, we've got the worm farm underneath. So I put my food scraps here. As you can see, if we dig around, very happy there. No smell, no flies or anything like that. So this works well as long as the size of the raised garden bed's quite high, so rodents can't get in here. And this one is about 75 centimetres high. Works well, we've never seen a mouse here or anything. So that's a nice simple one there. The next one I've got here is actually amongst all the potatoes I'm growing. My purple potatoes, one of my favourite varieties. So I've got some white things on top, which is to reflect the heat, but underneath, we simply have one of the stackable worm farms that you normally buy, actually buried into the ground here. If I uncover this one actually is quite mature, so we're about to harvest this one. If we uncover this one here, can see it's full of the beautiful castings, quite dense at the moment, that we're about to harvest. Once you've decided what's the best worm farm for you and your situation, the next thing when establishing the worm farm is getting the initial bedding together. The bedding material will be the home base for the worms. It's where they're going to live and thrive, and they're also going to eat that as well. The food scraps are going to be on top, but the bedding is where they're going to hang out. So there's many different types of bedding, and when it comes down to it, what's really important is more is better. You really want to have a depth of at least 15 centimetres when you're first establishing a worm farm. So there's many different types of things you can use for bedding. Aged manure works quite well. Aged compost works really well. That's castings there, we're going to use a bit of that. But the two things that I think work really well together is coconut fibre, which you can buy in bricks and soak in water, and newspaper. So whenever you're doing bedding, it's really important to ensure that it's not too wet. You want it to be wet but not saturated. So you should be able to grab a handful of it, and it's a squeeze test. Squeeze it hard and you should only get a few drops out of it. If you're getting too much, a rush of water, well then it's too wet and you want to squeeze that excess water out of it. Newspaper is good because even the coloured newspaper uses a vegetable-based toner. So it's fine for the worms, it's not going to build up toxins in your soil. Always check first, make sure you haven't got shiny paper. This has toxins in it. It's not going to harm the worms, but I prefer to keep that out of the farm. Shred your newspaper. Get it together. Soak it in water. Squeeze out your excess moisture. The worms are going to love that, especially if you mix it with a few other things. So other materials you can use are things such as pea straw and sugarcane mulch. You don't want too much of that. It doesn't tend to hold the moisture as well as things such as newspaper and coconut fibre. But it's really important to get a mix together too. I mean, worms will live just in that or just in the coconut fibre, but variety is good. So I'm going to get a bit of a mix going there. Again, I'm going to throw some castings in there too because I've got them. Okay, so now we have a good mix of bedding material together. It's got lots of air in it, and air is really important because it's going to enable the worms to move around. So we always want the process of worm farming to be aerobic. So you should never smell a worm farm. If you do, it means probably things are going a bit anaerobic, and there's many reasons that could happen. But this is nice and friable, nice and airy, and the worms are going to get established in that very quickly. So now we have the bedding material. It's just a matter of adding that to the farm and making sure we've got that depth of about 15 centimetres. Now we're going to set up this worm farm. This one's empty, ready to go. Put the lid aside. We've got the bedding material that we just made up. So I'm just going to add this to this now. Okay, that's got the bedding material in it now. It looks quite full, and you might think that doesn't leave any room for the food scraps. But the worms are going to consume the bedding material too. And worms can reduce the volume of food waste and bedding material by about 95%. So this is going to sink down quite a bit. Now it's just a matter of adding the worms. After worm farming for around 6 to 9 months, maybe a little bit longer, it's going to get to the stage where you can do a worm harvest and casting harvest. So the worm castings, or the vermicast, is all that beautiful black gold the worms have made after consuming the bedding and all the food material and the food waste. When you've got a mature worm farm, it's almost like a birthday cake. You've got a mud cake down the bottom, which is all your pure castings, and the icing on top is your food scraps and where most of the worms are going to be. So what you can do is you can scrape those worms off the birthday cake, put them aside, they're ready to go into a new worm farm. And then dump the rest of it on a bit of plastic. Here I'm using a bit of a board, and we're ready to separate the worms from the castings. So the important thing to remember is worms hate light, and also they hate vibrations. So I've dumped it here, I've broken it all up, and it's not a very sunny day today, but the very vibrations on the surface is enough to make the worms go down to the bottom. And worms are quite amazing in that they can communicate with each other. They've got a brain, they're actually quite intelligent, and they have some way of forming a ball to protect each other. So worms will do that naturally to protect each other. So what I can do now is, this has been sitting here for about half an hour. I'm going to scrape off the top. And as you can see here, it's all pure castings. There's a little worm there, we'll put him aside. So all you need to do is just scrape the castings aside, and this is what you're going to use. When you get to the point where you start to see worms, well then we can wait and give them a little bit more time to burrow down. So around the edges here, we're very unlikely to see any worms. You can sort of see we can, almost using our fingers like a rake, and just keep doing this until you start to see worms again. So I'm going to stop. I'm just going to bunch this up a bit now and just rough them up a little bit. I think the worms are burrowed down quite nicely now. Use our fingers as rakes. Oh yeah, look at that. Starting to expose the worms. And this is the perfect ball. So the more they form the ball, the more they push the castings to the surface. You can see there, the worms are looking after each other by forming this perfect ball. So what we have now is close to 1 kilogram of worms, which is roughly 4,000 worms when it comes to these breeds of composting worm. Okay, now we're going to add the worms to this farm. For a farm this size, you could start off with 1/4 kilogram of worms, which is about 1,000 worms. 1/2 kilo would probably be more ideal, because they're going to get established very quickly and start going through all your food waste. I'm going to put through closer to 1 kilo here. So I've dumped the worms there. I'm just going to spread them out, and they will very quickly get established in there. So the worms that we have here don't get bigger than this. There's 3 different varieties of composting worm that we're using here. There's the red wrigglers, the Indian blues, and the tiger worms. And they're the ones that want to live in a dedicated farm and consume your food scraps. There's other composting worms out there. There's the African night crawlers, but we don't tend to use them in this sort of climate because they're a little bit finicky when it comes to conditions. Now, most things that you see or read tell you to let the worms settle in for 4 or 5 days before you start feeding them. I don't get that. Like, for me, that's like moving into a house and the builder saying don't use the kitchen for a week. So you can start feeding straight away. A worm farm is a gradual process. So even though they mightn't eat the food scraps straight away, it's going to start to break down and soften, and the worms are going to hoe into it. So I'm going to feed this worm farm now, even though the worms are still settling in. There's a lot of things you also read about what the worms can and can't eat. With a farm this size, it's only a very small surface area, so I wouldn't put too much citrus in it, or acidic foods, or dairy foods, or cooked meat. A little bit's still fine, but it's our bigger farms where we keep all that sort of stuff in. I bought my bin from home today, my food scraps in it, my family's food scraps. So another thing you read too is it's great to blend all your food before you feed the worms. Again, I don't get that. It's making a mess in the kitchen, there's more cleaning up to do. Might as well let the worms do the work. And the more you have sloppy food and congealed food, the more likely it's going to be rot in the farm. So it's good to have chunky food. So I'd recommend use a knife and chop rather than blend. So I'm just going to pour this in here now. If I just left the food scraps like that, it might start to congeal and rot. So the secret is try to spread it out as much as possible. So there we go. It's nice and airy there. Now I'll just put the lid on top. Done. So we've put bedding in this worm farm, added the worms, and given its first feed all in the space of 10 minutes. Siting a worm farm is really important because for some crazy reason this is made out of black plastic, which is just a heat trap when the sun hits it. For probably 3/4 of the year in Australia, you'd want to keep this completely in the shade so it doesn't get too hot. So trying to site this somewhere where it's going to stay out of the sun is really important, whether that be under a deciduous tree or in the carport or somewhere really, really shady in your yard. If you can't do that, it's good to cover it with something white that's going to reflect that heat. So use something like white shade cloth or a white board or even a white table like this, and that's going to help reflect that heat and make sure the worm farm doesn't get too hot. Because even the air temperature around this can make this worm farm get really hot, and the worms aren't going to be very happy at all. So I'm going to put this worm farm, as my new worm farm, around my potato plants. Put it there. I'm about to add more material around here for my potatoes, so I'll get a really, really good harvest. And because this is direct sunlight here, it only gets about 3 hours of shade every day. I'm just going to use these metal shelves to give them that extra protection and reflect that heat off. And these worms will be very happy there. Okay, so now after separating the worms from our castings, we have the black gold. This is the stuff that's just incredibly good for your gardens. One thing to keep in mind, bud, is worms don't eat anything that's alive, and they won't eat seed. So seeds might rot eventually in a worm farm, but a lot of them are going to stay viable. And the most common ones are things such as tomatoes and capsicums and things like that. So if you spread this all over the surface of your garden or all over your pot plants, the plant's going to love it, but you're going to get lots of little renegades growing in there. So it's best to put the castings underneath the root zone. So if you're planting productive plants such as lettuce and tomatoes and capsicums, get a good handful, put it in the bottom of your hole, plant on top, and that's pretty much all the food that plant's going to need for the whole season. You can also turn this into a liquid fertilizer. All you need is a stocking or a brewer's bag, which they use for making beer, and put a few handfuls in it, soak it in a bucket of water, let it soak there for a couple of days, squeeze it every now and then you got yourself a worm tea. That worm tea is going to be quite strong and you still want to dilute it at least 10:1, but your plants are going to love it. It's going to have no odour at all. You can use it indoors, you're not going to smell it at all, and plants will respond very, very quickly to it, because not only is it full of nutrients, which the worms are recycled, but it's absolutely full of beneficial microbes, which is going to help all your plants take up the nutrients in the soil. And that's the bit that science is still catching up on, but the worms are known about for millions of years. Well, thanks for hanging out with me and the worms here today at Canberra City Farm and our global worming operation. And I hope it's helped you in the decision to establishing a farm, whether you should do it at home or improving your worm farming skills. So get out there and give it a go, and as I said before, it's the ultimate pet you can have.